Welcome to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. It's like coffee with an analyst, or it could be whiskey with an analyst reading a spreadsheet, linking crime events, identifying a series, and getting the latest scoop on association news and training. So please don't beat that analyst and join us as we define the law enforcement analysis profession one episode at a time.
Thank you for joining me. I hope many aspects of your life are progressing. My name is Jason Elder, and today our guest has over 10 years of law enforcement analysis experience, with 17 years of law enforcement experience overall. She has gone from records clerk, crime prevention specialist, to crime analyst supervisor at Fayetteville Police Department in Virginia. She now works at Amtrak as a manager in the Safety and Security Analytics Division. She's here to talk about, among other things, the progression from the public sector to the private sector. Please welcome Rachael Songalewski. Rachael, how we doing?
Doing great, Jason. Thank you for having me.
Did I do okay on that name?
Yes. Yes, you did.
It's funny. You work up to it, you get it right in your head, and then it's like showtime, and you're like, I paused there. I could feel myself pausing there, and I was like, oh, Jason, you had it. You should have just naturally said it, and then it would have been fine. But I did feel myself pause. So, all right. Well, how did you discover the law enforcement analysis profession?
Oh, wow. So I discovered law enforcement analysis it was probably in the 2010-2011 timeframe when I was working as a crime prevention specialist there at the Fayetteville Police Department. The reason I discovered the profession was because in my job as a crime prevention specialist, we were in a role where we were community liaison. So what that meant is, we use data, crime statistics, hotspot maps, things like that were produced by the crime analysis unit to facilitate community conversation. So we hosted meetings with our community watch groups, things like that. And those stats and those maps, all that information would come from our crime analyst. So naturally, I formed a relationship with our crime analyst unit. And then a position opened up in 2012. And again, having a good relationship with our crime analysis unit, I was encouraged to apply for that new position. And that's how I really kind of got my foot in the door with it.
Yeah, the progression is fascinating with your career, even going back to being a records clerk. How did you discover being a records clerk?
So I came into the field really at 19. I joined the Fayetteville Police Department at 19 years old.
Wow.
Just getting my professional career off the ground, figuring out what you want to be when you grow up type of thing. And I was actually getting ready to be a brand new mom. And so, you're doing all this where you're balancing life in general. And Fayetteville Police Department had a position open up. They said, you know what, this is a great entry level job for me as a young woman trying to establish herself in the world. And I applied and had an interview, as you can imagine, very young, naive, inexperienced person. And I surprisingly knocked it out of the park. So spent about 4.5 years in records. And I'll tell you, Jason, that right there has been a foundation for success for me in law enforcement analysis. And the reason I say that is because it gave me such an intimate understanding of the law enforcement records that I would one day work with in a different capacity. I got to see firsthand police reports and how all of the data was entered, the fields, how the information was collected, data integrity issues, all of these things I got to see firsthand. And I got to experience, collecting that information from the public and taking those police reports. I also got exposure to DCI and running NCIC queries, things like that. So my time in record really was a very, very good foundation for me as I eventually moved into the analysis profession.
Okay. So when you're taking reports from civilians, these are obviously non-911 calls type events that they're reporting, like their car got broken into, for instance.
Correct. Exactly. It's non-emergency items, so like fraud reports or delayed reportings for different thefts, something where an officer's response is not going to be needed for things like evidence collection or any type of actual emergency response. Anytime that, maybe that came to us and we realized there was a need for truly an officer to respond, we would defer it back to maybe dispatch. But we would take public walk-in, again, theft reports, even delayed breaking and entering of vehicles, where everything of evidentiary value has gone out the door, and, just really helping them with the police report for whatever their needs are at that time. So yeah, it was being able to sit down, take reports like that. We took missing person and runaway juvenile type report, things that needed to go again into NCIC and items like that.
So not only are you taking the reports, are you also doing the data entry as well?
Exactly. Lots of data entry, entering not just police reports, but traffic citations, warning tickets, arrest rec, contact filled interview cards, all of those things. I got to enter all of the data and see how it actually got input into the system. And again, going a few years into the future, I had a very good understanding of the system, our records management system, CAD, all of that. So it kind of helped me learn the database in a different way.
Oh. When you think back about this time, you said you did this roughly 4 years. Is there a story or is there something that comes to mind when you think back about this time?
Well, I started on the night shift, working 12-hour weekend night shifts. And then I ended up eventually going to 12-hour day shifts and all that. I like the 12-hour weekends because I got my weeks free, right? And again, remember I said I was a new mom, so me and my son got to spend more quality time together. But it's just what I remember back then. It was always interesting, always something new. Usually at nighttime, you're fielding a lot of calls from folks that may be emotionally disturbed persons type situations, or those may be a little bit of with mental health issues, and you end up just in conversation with people. I've had plenty of conversations where you just sit there at 3:00 in the morning and maybe just listen to somebody talk, and that's all they want. And sometimes I remember there's one lady, she used to call her religiously 3:00 on the dot, and she just wanted to say her piece, and then she would hang up. And it was it was no interruption to my day, but she felt heard and all was well, right? Yeah. So it's just a different experience with my community there. And again, every time her address popped up, I kind of knew what was going on there, right? Yeah. As calls for service come in, different things like that, you start to know the story with your community.
Yeah. All right. So let's move on to the crime prevention specialist, because this is another stepping stone. I mean, you have two really interesting jobs prior to becoming an analyst, I feel, because as you've already mentioned, that it's just those were the base of a good platform to leap from. And so when you get into the crime prevention specialist position, what types of activities are you doing?
So I'll tell you, when I originally applied for crime prevention, again, I'm a type of person where I try to be all that I can be in a position, learn everything I can, and then I'm ready to progress, right? And so I had a great time in records. I learned a great deal, worked with some fabulous colleagues there, but I was ready for growth. And so I applied for crime prevention, and I was under the impression that I might be doing the cool stuff like working with McGruff and doing those types of, everybody has that notion where they're like, McGruff the crime dog. It was just a kind of a running joke. And I remember saying that in my interview that I was excited about McGruff.
When do I meet him?
When do I get to take McGruff out, right? And so that was I remembered, again, I'm, maybe in my early 20s by this time. And, the naiveness of all that was really comical, because I remember as a child seeing Fayetteville Police Department out at the mall with McGruff, right? And this is what stuck out in my mind. So as they're telling me, well, we actually don't do McGruff anymore, I was like, really? Really?
I'm out. I'm done.
Right? I was like, well, so tell me more about what it is that, or what are the core focuses. And what I quickly learned with crime prevention is you were there to be a department representation and community liaison. The city of Fayetteville had, at the time, 165 community watch groups. And for a city of just under 209,000 residents at the time, that's a lot of community watch groups. And so I learned a great deal in that position about community partnerships and bringing the community to the table, educating them on what was occurring in their community, realizing what their perception was. And when I say perception, I mean perception of criminal activity within their neighborhoods or surrounding areas, what was important to them, and then being able to share back, right? And this is kind of what I was talking about earlier with the statistics portion. I would come in and share their calls for service information. We would come in and share the highlights of, criminal activity that had occurred for situational awareness. And then what we would do is encourage reporting. Could we answer questions? The whole goal behind it was keeping the community empowered with information so that they would, again, view this as a partnership, because there is absolutely no way, we know this in the law enforcement profession, there's absolutely no way that the police can handle all of these issues alone. It must be a partnership from all facets. So, with crime prevention, it really exposed me to that, and it really enhanced my public speaking skills. That's where I really got the bulk of my experience with public speaking, because I was doing multiple presentations a week. And so I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a lot. We didn't just work with community watch groups. We worked with our religious community, our faith-based community rather. We worked with businesses. We did presentations to schools on safety. We conducted security assessment. I became certified back in, I think, 2011 as a crime prevention through environmental design specialist. So CPTED, that's where I got introduced to CPTED. Yeah.
Yes.
And it was great. So I spent 3.5 years as a crime prevention specialist, and it was very, very rewarding.
So then how did the groups get assigned to you?
So it depends, right? So for Community Watch, there were 6 of us citywide. And what we would do is we would break up, you have your police districts and you have sectors and zones and the various boundaries, right? We would break the areas of responsibility up into zones. So I had very specific police zones. And so all the groups within those zones would get assigned to me. Now, of course, we backed each other up. If someone was going to be out, we could cover another specialist area and such. But really, the way that they were assigned was geographically.
Man, so I could just imagine some of the characters that you must have met during this. And what I mean by that is there's just some people that really get involved with some of these crime statistics. And we had some of them in Cincinnati Police Department when I was there. And I was like, I cannot believe how much analysis you're doing as a civilian for your neighborhood. I was pretty impressed with the data that they would get and what they would do with the data and the questions that they would ask. I mean, it was way more sophisticated than what I ever imagined it would be.
And Jason, I would agree with you wholeheartedly. So, another tidbit about the city of Fayetteville. The city of Fayetteville is also home to Fort Bragg, very big military community, which means we also had a lot of, military analysts or people that worked a lot with data, and they would consume the information in various ways and sometimes put their own interpretation on it, and other times ask very detailed questions. And so, sometimes that does catch you off guard. You're like, wow, I didn't realize we're all in that way. But now I'm not only impressed, but intrigued, and we'll see where this goes, right? So, yeah.
So it does sound like part of the mission there was, and as you mentioned, reporting, getting the citizens to be comfortable with reporting on information. Were you able to track that, or did see improvement over time with all these presentations that you were given, that there was either more calls for service or people felt more comfortable with calling the police when they needed to?
So yes, we did. And that was the thing, is it depended on the community, right? What we were able to see was, again, it really depended on where the group was located, their involvement with the group. What we noticed is that those that you didn't have to have the largest group to have the most involvement. Some of the biggest levels of involvement were those that were just very intimate, but were consistent. So those groups meeting monthly, coming in and having conversation and being willing to have that conversation. It didn't mean we always had to come to the table and agree, because that often, that didn't happen all the time. We would come to the table and talk about the problems and potential solutions. And so a part of the process in crime prevention is, number one, educating people on the process. This is how it works, right? So when you observe this, what should you do? Letting people know that you should report suspicious activity and not ignore it because you think it's really not an emergency. Changing the mindset of people to let them know it was okay to call 911 when something was more just on the suspicious range versus reaching the level of actual crime in progress and or emergency. That was definitely a mindset change that they didn't realize that was okay. And it goes back to the whole see something, say something concept, right? We're trying to encourage people to tell us things so that we can mitigate it beforehand, or at least it leads us to a potential investigative lead down the road. So, we did a big education pretty frequently on that and would have lots of conversations. And we did notice escalations in suspicious activity reporting and things like that. And again, one thing I always tried to do was, if information led to a result, that was critical to take back to my community groups and say, hey, listen, you guys reported this, we did something with this, or it led to this. And that always resonated with people. They're like, somebody's listening. They're trying. They cared. I feel good about these results because it mattered to me. You have to give people that feedback.
Yeah, that is important. And when you were talking there, I got to thinking it's funny because some people are more comfortable belly aching on Nextdoor app than they would be to actually call the police a non-emergency line. But just people are funny, I guess. But you mentioned CPTED, and that's a topic that we really haven't covered much on the program. You think about it as like, lighting's always a big one. I always think of like landscaping and certain aspects that way of trying to make sure that you don't give criminals a nice canvas to work with, basically. Do you have either a CPTED concept that you really like, or maybe something that you feel is little known in terms of CPTED?
So the biggest thing that I always shared with folks when we were doing these studies, really CPTED is all about target hardening, right? With CPTED, we look at vulnerability points. So it kind of goes back to like what you were just saying about lighting, about shrubbery, doing something as simple as planting hostile shrubbery near vulnerable points sends a message of, keep out, makes it uncomfortable, right? Trimming bushes down to, no higher than 3 feet, having proper fencing. It's things like when I was in crime prevention, and probably one of the biggest CPTED studies that I did was for an entire apartment complex. We had an apartment complex who really took the safety and security of the residents and the entire complex very seriously. And so when they had occurrences, they made the call and said, hey, what can someone help us with some target hardening measures and things like that? And I'm like, sure, okay, sounds good. So, sometimes when you go out and you do those studies and you write up this report, because CPTED reports they were often book reports, right? Because you're going out, you're taking photos, and you're looking at everything, the whole geography, the building, all the structure, all of it. I remember doing some of those reports, and I'm sure it just sat on some people's desks and collected dust. But this one apartment complex actually took my report and just overhauled the whole place. It ended up, by the time they were done, ended up being a gated community. They had, access control, cameras installed, proper lighting. I mean, I was like, wow, it was really, it was nice to see someone really take that seriously. So, and again, apartment complexes, they're easy, right? Because, sometimes the doors aren't always the best or easy to kick in, different things like that. So it's just, we really went through and provided that viewpoint to say, hey, listen, you see how flimsy your doors are? We recommend things like steel doors or these types of locks, or just proper lighting when your residents come in here, or, hey, this pathway, you got points where an offender could potentially hide. And It's just there's room for a potential victim to come down here, so on and so forth. So that was really pleasing to have those results. And again, that apartment complex is in a great area and doing well from last I heard. So.
No, that's a good story. When you first said apartment complex, my head went straight to like residential burglary. And I'm thinking about access points into the building and outside of the building. And is there a lobby and how does people come and go? But then you mentioned about, stuff outside the apartment complex, more like the parking lot area and where people could hide. And then that's a whole other level of vulnerability for the residents, is not so much of their apartment, but when they go to their vehicle.
Absolutely. And that was one thing that we really honed in on, because that apartment complex was surrounded by woods as well. And then you had a lot of trees within the complex. So it was a very natural environment, but that provided a lot of coverage. And when you're walking on a pathway, there's tall shrubs hiding you and trees providing perfect coverage and poor lighting. The potential to become a victim is elevated, right? And so those were the things that we took pictures. I took pictures in the daytime, the nighttime, just at different points, so it could just be pointed out in that report.
Yeah. Did you by chance ever look at like the trend line for that apartment complex? Because you mentioned that it was turned into a gated community. I can't imagine what the calls for service and crime was like before and then what it was like after, because obviously putting up a gate and having a gated community really reduces the number of crimes for the facility.
Yes, we did. And that was the thing about it, is there was the sharp decline, because when you make that many changes, you decrease accessibility. So those without a need to access couldn't freely gain that access, right? So you reduce that foot traffic, thus reducing opportunity. And so I know I tracked it for a little while after that, and sometimes they were single digits with occurrences. The most activity that really ever occurred was the occasional domestic dispute. But things like car burglaries, residential burglaries had a sharp decline, and truly kudos to that management for taking ownership over the safety of that particular community.
Yeah. So you had mentioned in the beginning when you talked about how you discovered law enforcement analysis that it was during this time as a crime prevention specialist that you started working with crime analysts and getting information from them, and that's how you developed a relationship with them. And I think you said someone encouraged you to apply to the crime analyst position. So was it something that you just like never envisioned yourself as a crime analyst? It wasn't like I never really thought about it that way, or was there a point in time when you were a crime specialist that, you know what, that's really where I want to go?
So for me, it was more of, I can't say that I wasn't interested. I think I just didn't know enough about the field to say that I was interested or not just yet. I was interested in the things that they put out and the things that they worked on, but not having a full-on understanding. I was a little intimidated, right? Because you're seeing these complex analysis products being put out. They work for the chief. Everything is so, you know how that goes. I think it was a lack of understanding. And when I sat down and, I was having conversations about the stats that I needed for my community groups and things like that, what happened was one of the analysts said, hey, if this is something you're going to be running all the time and you need these on a regular basis, let me just give you the program and teach you how to run some of these queries and let me turn you loose because I'm tired of doing this. I'm too busy. And I'm like, cool, sounds good to me.
Nice.
And so, she actually got me a license for crystal reports and taught me how to run queries, very simple queries against CAD and RMS. So I started, learning some simplistic things about connections to the database on the back end, things like that, and building out very, very simple reports. But I was, self-sufficient now. And then she's free to go and do what she needs to do. She's not constantly running my stuff, and it worked out well. Because we did form such a good relationship, what happened is the city of Fayetteville was actually embarking on a new ordinance and it was called the Rental Action Management Program. It is honestly a very short-lived program because legislation ended up killing it. But the goal was to hold property owners accountable for their rental properties that, maybe weren't reaching the level of like nuisance abatement, but they, we might have high levels of crime and or different types of, what's the word I'm looking for? Environmental type issues, code enforcement. That's the word I'm looking for.
There you go.
There we go. So the Rental Action Management Program would hold landlords accountable for code enforcement as well as criminal activity, right? So you get the term like slumlord that you'll hear people say, or just non-involved, non-present owners of properties that just collect rent and allow whatever activity to take place. The city of Fayetteville became very involved in that initiative because it was almost a 50% rental rate, and we were seeing the tie to criminal activity to rental properties. And so what we wanted was, folks to take ownership over their properties, conduct background checks, have good leases in place, things like that. So give them like work with the community and understanding of the geography, different things like that. She said, hey, they wanted crime analysts in there to do this program. And so she said, hey, we, really like you to consider applying. And I'm like, I don't know. I don't know if I'm cut out for this. And she's like, no, you are. And I was like, okay. So I went in, spent some time with them, learned a little bit of crime mapping, again, a little bit of data pulls, different things like that. Just learned more about what their unit was actually doing. And I said, okay, you know what? I'm going to shoot my shot and throw my name in the hat and see what happens.
So how was the interview?
And looking back now, 10 years later, I did well. I presented well because there was a public speaking portion. I had been doing public speaking for 3.5 years straight. So yeah. I could say I nailed the presentation part, but I would say okay on the analysis questions. Like I knew enough to be dangerous and to build a foundation on, but I would say now, hindsight being 2020, I think I did okay. They ended up hiring me, so.
Yeah, because imagine if your initial interview was recorded and you were given the recording like when you retire. Like, could you imagine?
I would agree.
Oh my gosh. I would be mortified to see some of my interview tapes, but at the same time, I'm sure they're really entertaining as well.
No doubt. No doubt.
So then you get assigned to this project of them going after the landlords. Is it a new penalty or is it a new law? What are they doing with this program?
It's truly an ordinance. It ended up being a city ordinance. And what we were seeing is City of Fayetteville was not the only one embarking on a journey like this. I think we were the only ones coming at it from both a crime and code enforcement standpoint, but we were seeing other municipalities come at it from either or. But so what we were doing with that, again, is we were reviewing crime data. Crime would be given kind of a weighted value, and you would have a ranking system. And so there was, I think a threshold. I don't remember if it was top 10, top 15 properties, or if you reached a certain threshold, what it was you would be issued a warning letter, have to go through a communication process with the city. And if it reached a secondary threshold or you failed to, communicate with us, you would be entered into the program and have to go through a process to be removed from the program. So there were fines involved if you failed to mitigate the issue or implement the strategies outlined in your action plan, things like that. But it didn't last very long. Like I came on in July of 2012, and by probably not quite the end of 2013, we were being shifted elsewhere. So I spent the bulk of 2012 and 2013 providing information to assist with legislative battles around it. There were House bills introduced that said, hey, this is not right the way that's being approached. We need to, come up with something better. At the end of the day, the juice ended up not being worth the squeeze for everything that they were asking for. So what you saw is everybody just kind of kill their programs off and go a different route. And so myself and my counterpart that actually got hired at the same exact time for that program, we were shifted into actually more of an intelligence role by the end of 2013. We had gotten a new chief, and when he came in the door, he had a vision of making the analytical unit more robust. And so we were asked if we were okay with transitioning into a criminal intelligence role.
Yeah. I guess I understand that program could be difficult to implement. Again, when I was at Cincinnati Police Department, we would have landlords and like, well, how would I even be able to find out what goes on in my apartment complex or my apartment? And we had to start supplying data, right? Because that wasn't readily available at the time. It is an interesting scenario that you put them in because they are landlords and they, in some respects, that their tenants are adults and they act up and that's on them kind of thing. But certainly when you have scenarios where you have constant calls for service and constant blight there, that it is worth the city's effort to try to reduce and improve certain areas.
Yeah, it was, and I would say the catalyst for it is the repeat occurrences at some of these properties. It kind of goes back to some like the 80-20 theory, right? 80% of your issues caused by maybe 10 to 20% of the population or of a group of offenders, right? And so with rental properties, what we saw was there was a small portion that were consistently repeat offenders, if you will, for lack of a better term. That's what we saw. There was constant either calls for service related to shots fired. There were like search warrants being conducted, some with robberies and or homicides. It was constant. And so you go through so much to reach the level of actual nuisance abatement and property seizure and things like that. And again, depends on your state, right? But, they wanted something that they could implement to hold the property owners accountable for the activity that was taking place. And that meant doing things like, again, background checks for your applicants, just having a stronger lease that outlined the rules of the property. Because I can't tell you how many property owners we sat down and talked with. They didn't even have a lease. They didn't know who was in the property. They never did background checks, the whole thing. They did not care and if their money was coming in, it was, hey, whatever. Yeah. I don't care what they do. I don't care what it looks like, just whatever. The neighbors around them were suffering because of it. And the community's like, listen, we're dealing with this all the time. We have no peace, and they won't do anything about it. We're calling them. They're not doing anything about it. So I think it was a good attempt. The heart was in the right place. I just think the logistics were not there to be in our favor with that.
Hi, I'm John. I'm a crime analyst with the Saskatoon Police Service. The public service announcement that I have is especially for junior analysts, but also senior analysts. Just be true to yourself and recognize that the police culture that you're in shouldn't necessarily shape who you are, but you have something to bring towards your service as a benefit as well.
Hi, this is Dr. Carlena Orosco from the Tempe Police Department, Arizona State University. And my public service announcement is that correlation does not equal causation. If you find that certain things are occurring that may be contributing to a decrease or an increase in crime, for example, that gives an opportunity to investigate it a little bit further to see if possibly there are things contributing. But it does not mean that one thing caused the decline or the increase. It just means that there's an opportunity to explore it a little bit further.
This is Jennifer Loper. When using the last of the TP, replace the roll the right way.
As you mentioned, you get shipped off to Intel, which seems like a hard left turn for you at this point in your life. So what was that like going into Intel?
So actually, it was a little bit easier of a transition than what you might think, simply because the program that myself and my colleague were in with the rental property items, the two of us were, we're very motivated individuals. We get our stuff done and we're like, okay, on what else can we get our hands on? And so the volume of work at the time with that program, it wasn't really heavy, right? You do your stats, you do your reports. Okay, cool. So what else can we take on? So we had started working with our nuisance abatement officer on his cases. And when we did such a good job for him, that led us to being introduced to an officer who was being placed into a brand new position as a prostitution diversion officer. And what happened is she came in, she said, hey, can you guys help me with some research, with some information collection, data compiling, things like that, and help me get this thing off the ground? And so we started dabbling in it even before our transition. And so when we get shipped off to the intel world, it was like, okay, we're just kind of stepping up, right, into this whole process. So our chief, he wanted to call it the Crime Information Center because he had a vision of intelligence as well as crime analysis and a blend of that. Because remember, the crime analysts that recruited me to come over were still in existence and focusing on a lot of tactical and strategic and administrative elements. But, there was also now this new intelligence portion. So it was a lot of open source and intelligence. We focused a lot on making, the connections between people and entities and cases. And we really got involved with human trafficking big time after that.
All right. So this leads us to your analyst badge story. And for those that may be new to the show, the analyst badge story is there's the career defining case or project that an analyst works. So this deals with human trafficking. You just started. You went from working your way up with the community, working with property, to now you get this case in dealing with human trafficking.
Yeah. So I'll tell you, my introduction truly to the world of human trafficking, really it started with a spree of robberies that we were having in the city. And, as we were digging through this, we noticed a very strong correlation to prostitution style setup robberies. And so it worked pretty tirelessly doing research on the people involved. We looked at the victimology, what was it that was going on? And then we discovered the prostitution nexus. Okay, we have a group and or individual prostitutes setting up Johns, and then their male counterparts would come in and conduct the robbery, pretty violent robberies at gunpoint. And that led us to discover a gang connection. And so that's kind of how, that was really the catalyst for introduction. Between that and working with our prostitution diversion officer, that's when we really started to dig into the entire world. So fast forward a few years, I've been working, human trafficking cases for quite a while, done a lot of case support, investigative research, open source intelligence, all of these things. And so part of that, was social media research. And, as far as badge story goes, probably one of the most important cases that I ever worked on was a case that involved an individual, actually a female trafficker, who was recruiting juveniles via Facebook. And the way I came across it was there was a scorned female who our victim had spoken to her boyfriend and it made her angry. So she outed her on social media and posted her. Yeah, she did. And I came across, I said, this looks like a child. And so I had to work backwards off of the information that I had. And I ended up discovering it's like she is, in fact, 15 years old. Wow. And I found her ads and all of these things. So I put everything together, I compile it, and I turn it over to now that prostitution diversion officer. She had now worked her way up to actual human trafficking detective. And so she ended up turned the case over to her with everything that I had, and we ended up working together on that one. She ended up doing search warrants on the social media profiles. That one juvenile and the search warrants that were done ended up leading to 2 additional juveniles being discovered as far as involved in the situation. And the long story short, we were able to do some intervention with a few of the juveniles, get them to services and get them out of the situation, things like that. The trafficker, I remember because I was not on scene when they conducted the actual search warrant on her residence, but as they were walking through the property, I was navigating them to items to look for. So I was going through the back page ads at the time, say, okay, we're looking for these particular clothing items or whatever the case was. And we ended up finding the clothing that she was putting on these children to make them model and ad. And so I got to be a part of that because I needed to be behind my computer providing that information real time into the field. And they ended up finding the evidence that they needed. And it was a huge win. And so with that case, the trafficker ended up getting 10 years in federal time, which is a really big deal, So I'll forever remember that because again, children, they're vulnerable, they're naive, they don't know, and there is no such thing as a child prostitute, right? Mm-hmm. I don't care what they said willingly, they would like to be involved. No. So those were situations where vulnerable victims were coerced into helping an individual unfortunately feed a drug habit. There's a lot of exploitation that took place there. So again, 10 years in federal prison, honestly, I hope does her some good.
Yeah, that's a lot. So what was that based off of? Were you able to prove several victims or overall impact? What drove that 10 years?
So what really drove the 10 years was the totality. It was, 3 juvenile victims. It was the recruitment in black and white through the social media messages. It was because we got her electronics, they did all the forensics on the electronics. We got the search warrant returns from Backpage and we were able to tie it back to her email address, just all the linkage. It was, there was no denying exactly what took place. So everything from the recruitment, the tops that she put on one of the girls, she was also wearing in her own photos. And so the combination of the clothing, the messages, everything from the forensics and the statement from the actual juveniles themselves about the manner in which they were recruited, how they were taken from Fayetteville to Raleigh, posted up in hotel rooms, forced to take pictures. And I think the impact of all of that, it was a no-brainer on the jury's end.
Yeah. Now, how prevalent is a female trafficker? Because I think most people, if you're doing a stereotype and you're thinking of a male trafficker, I think most people would think of it that way.
Yeah, and listen, the historical on that, sure, that's been a common theme with predominantly males being the traffickers. But what I noticed in working these cases for a number of years is there was always what we call the bottom, right? I'll keep the language clean on that and just kind of keep it the bottom female, if you will, but bottom always meant top. So there was always a female that was alongside potentially running the show, depending on the circumstances and such. But they were in an interesting situation, right? Because if there was a male trafficker and they were a part of the what we call the bottom female, if she was a part of the forced fraud and coercion, she is, in the same boat as he is. But when we had not seen as prevalent just a lone female trafficker rather often. And so that was not the first case I had ever come across with just a female trafficker not working alongside a male trafficker, but they are a little bit more rare. I do think the escalation in technology and the socialization of these different sites and making money and things like that, and then you combine that with, unfortunately with things like drug habits, you start to see an escalation in those types of things. So the numbers were pretty small and a little more rare back several years ago when I was really honing in on those cases. But I think we've seen some growth in that over the last few years for sure.
Yeah. To me, I would think a female may have more trust than a male in terms of coercion? I don't know that. I'm just thinking the young victims, if they're not really expecting a female to lure them into trafficking, they might be more easily diverted to that than a male trafficker.
And so, Jason, you hit the nail on the head with that, and that's the danger in it, right? She understands maybe ways to reach that female juvenile victim if that's what we're focusing on, like right now. There's a way that, she can to her a little differently. She comes across as a friend, as someone who's, girl, I got you. I'm supportive of you, that type of thing, versus what we see in male traffickers, where it's more of they take maybe a relationship approach, or, let me love you type of thing. The female traffickers you come across as more of a friend, and it's a little softer sometimes. And again, it definitely varies case to case. And, I've had cases where we've had both female and male victims in these situations, male and female traffickers, and things like that. But yeah, it is a different dynamic with a female trafficker from a coercion standpoint, because it is sometimes a softer approach.
Yeah. In terms of trafficking overall, what do you think there may be some misnomers that most of the public doesn't get, or maybe it's just some misinformation out there?
So one thing really probably stands out the most, and again, the term human trafficking, the entire concept of human trafficking is really newer to society, if you will. And what I'll say about that is there was a perception when I first started working on this that somehow, a child, a juvenile could be considered a prostitute, right? And that they were somehow not a victim. That's one thing that is a huge misconception, is a child can never consent to prostitution or anything like that. They just can't. They are always a victim, and for a number of reasons, right? The other things is, not what I've seen over the last few years really is human trafficking has become kind of a buzzword, and it's thrown about kind of freely. The big thing to remember with human trafficking is you do have to have the elements of force, fraud, and or coercion. You need those elements to really define it in that way, because again, there are individuals out there that are willingly in this field for one reason or another, and not every case of prostitution is human trafficking. Not everybody is in this because they are being forced to. There are some that do make that choice for their own reasons, but the big thing to remember is there is that side where individuals are not in that life because they choose to be. And so, I've definitely battled in my career of changing a law enforcement mindset before human trafficking, again, was the buzzword of the victim-centered approach, ensuring that we take care of the individual so that if there were the elements of force, fraud, and coercion, we could get them to a point of getting resources, getting out of the life, and being willing to testify against their trafficker later on in the court system, which was extremely challenging.
All right. Well, just moving on then, you eventually become crime analyst supervisor there at Fayetteville. Was that transition weird? Maybe going from you have coworkers one day to then you have analysts that report to you the next?
Of course it was. Absolutely. Your counterpart with folks one day, and then, we go from a sworn sergeant supervisor position to the department's now said, okay, we think we can benefit from a permanent civilian supervisor. And, you toss your name in the hat and see what happens. And then next thing you're taking over this boat, right? And so now your colleagues become your direct reports. And that is a transition. It's a transition for everyone involved, right?
So how many did you end up supervising in the beginning?
So when I first took over as supervisor, I had 4 crime analysts and 1 police officer. The unit that I had, the Crime Information Center, was we had analysts, and we had analysts as well as sworn staff, because we were essentially like a real-time crime center. We had lots of public safety technology with surveillance cameras, all kinds of different systems feeding in there. And so we had sworn camera operators who would monitor the radio, surveillance cameras, that type of thing. So we had a rotation of light duty officers that would come in, one permanent officer to the center, and then the 4 analysts.
Was it more odd supervising a sworn officer or supervising civilians?
Oh, great question. I think it was probably more odd supervising a sworn element. I guess you could say that, simply because they don't know what to expect being supervised and reporting to a civilian, right? So everyone's trying to figure it out, like, what do we do here? And so, obviously supervising civilians, I just came from, being exactly what the analysts were. So knowing how to navigate that world was a little bit easier, because I knew my counterpart, I knew what their skills were, their strengths, things like that. Whereas the officers, the big challenges there were, again, you have light duty officers who would rotate in and out. So as soon as you get to know somebody, you have a new rotation, things like that. But there was one permanently assigned officer who was with me, and I did have a sworn major that I reported to as well. So we between myself and the major, we balanced their law enforcement needs together, but their day-to-day operational items, I managed all of that. It was just kind of a figuring out process, but I think it ended up being very well in the end.
All right. As you think back, how did you think you did as a first-time supervisor?
You know what I would say is I had a lot to learn, for sure. But one thing that played to my advantage was the fact that I was born and raised in the city of Fayetteville. So I knew it inside and out, like the back of my hand. I knew our systems very well, all those types of things. As I became the supervisor, the week I actually had to hire 2 brand new analysts at the exact same time I was taking over. So I had 2 individuals that were working in the unit at the time, and then 2 new ones that I was hiring. So I was in a process of transitioning to supervisor and then training 2 new folks at the same time.
Wow.
Yeah. And so I knew there was a lot of things that I said, if I was given the opportunity to become the supervisor, I knew all the things that I griped about, and I knew all the things that I didn't like, and I vowed to change those things. I vowed to listen and, absorb. And then if I'm going to gripe about it, then I need to put an action plan in place. And that was one thing they knew about me, is if I said I was going to do something, that I was going to be persistent and work to get that done.
Yeah. Do you have a for instance there?
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. I told them I absolutely hated the layout of the unit. It looked like an AT&T call center. Truly. It was awful, because we were all sitting in these little pod desks side by side with our back facing the doors. It was just not customer friendly. When somebody walks in the door, your back's to them, and then you're blocking the screens, things like that. So I thought, I hate this. I'm going to completely, remodel this place. So I did. I ended up, by the time all was said and done, I remodeled the entire room, and it looked great. The center was not just the analytical unit or where the cameras were. It oftentimes turned into an operation center. So special events, critical incidents, all of that, everyone would funnel into our unit, because again, we had all the operational items. We had the information flowing, to the field, all of that. We had drones, all of that fed, I had mobile cameras that we could deploy out, all those types of things. We often turned into like an ops center or command post, if you will. So I needed to make the environment, and we needed to configure it better for bringing people in to work. So putting in things like a big conference table, and creating additional workstations, and raising the back counter up so people could actually see the screens and things like that. So that's kind of a poor instance. It was a massive overhaul, but it was ended up being really good, and it was needed.
So you're coming in as a new supervisor, and not only are you a new supervisor, you're hiring 2 new positions as well. So thinking back, how was that hiring process? How do you rate yourself?
You know what? I think I got better over time. I learned a lot of different things. So one of the folks that I hired as I came on, she's actually still there in Fayetteville, still going strong.
Yeah.
And so she came in 2018. It's, been 4.5 years, and she's still there, going really strong. The other analyst that I hired at the time, she ended up being fantastic. I ended up plugging her into my old spot in vice, so gangs, human trafficking, all those things. And she was tenacious, just a absolute fantastic researcher. She was just she could make people connections, and she put together an entire gang Rolodex and just really painted a picture. And she would network with other municipalities, making connections to not only Fayetteville cases, but Raleigh and Durham and Rocky Mount, all these types of things. And so her information ended up going all over the place. And so she was fantastic. And she ended up moving up north and taking a position with a department up north to be closer to family. But, she was absolutely a great hire.
Yeah, you're allowed dropping names on this show. Who are these analysts?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So the one that ended up leaving and heading up to Hartford was Leah Hewer. And Leah, again, I brag on her all the time because, again, she just had that tenacious spirit and she exumed a lot of confidence. She'll forever get a good job reference from me because her work was great. And then the other one that I hired to fill in Fayetteville was Jennifer Donmez. Jennifer came to us from the NSA. She had a really good background with them, did a lot of signals intelligence, human intelligence, things like that. And Jennifer, the reason I really brag on Jennifer, just because she has a very good personality. She gets very excited about her work. She's invested in it. And so, again, she's 4.5 years strong there in Fayetteville, and that's home to her. It's where she's from. And I'm really proud of both of them and their growth, for sure.
All right. So then, as I mentioned in your intro, you move on from Fayetteville Police Department to Amtrak. So let's talk about that transition, the decision to leave the department that you've worked at since you were 19 years old, and then to move on to Amtrak.
Yeah, and that's the crazy part, right? I spent 16 years with the city of Fayetteville, and to be honest, I didn't picture myself really ever moving on. I pictured retirement in my hometown, things like that. But kind of going back to an earlier point, I'm a person who enjoys and needs growth. And the only unfortunate side to working for local government is the limited growth opportunities. And so, being in the law enforcement analysis profession, I had peaked really with where I could go in the city. And I still had, 14 years left to retirement. I was only in my mid 30s. And so I'm like, hey, it is what it is. So I actually was not looking, had a recruiter reach out to me about a brand new opportunity that the Amtrak Police Department was embarking on. They had posted a new position, and kind of like at Fayetteville, they were looking to bring in a civilian manager over the analytical section and wanted to talk to me. So I was reached out to on LinkedIn about the new position.
That is interesting. And so you take this position, you've been there about a little over a year, and so what are you getting into in the Amtrak? Because I think, as we talked about in the prep call, I think most people didn't even realize that there was a law enforcement entity with Amtrak.
Yes. And so I will be very honest and say I did not either. The exposure that I had to the Amtrak Police Department was reports that would come out via our fusion center there in North Carolina, the State Bureau of Investigation, Isaac, that was the fusion center there, and they would disseminate reports that were collected from other law enforcement agencies and such. And so when I was in Fayetteville, I would come across reports, some monthly narcotic interdiction reports from the Amtrak Police Department, or the Rail Watch Weekly, which is a collection of open source items that it gets published out, things like that. So that was really the only exposure that I had. And so I didn't realize the magnitude of the Amtrak Police Department. And so, I get in here and realize, oh, wow, okay, cool. This is a department that's in 46 states, footprint. It's a department dealing with all of the exact same things that really, I was kind of dealing with at the local level and things like that, but just in a different way. And so it has been a very interesting and unique transition, because I walk in and I'm going, I have no idea. I have no idea about this environment. I have no exposure to the railroad. I have not even ridden a train before. This is completely foreign, completely new. I was well established in Fayetteville. I knew all the people, all the places, all the things. I walk in here and they're like, yes, welcome to the Nationwide Viewpoint and the railroad.
So then, are you still managing a team? What kind of tasks are you getting into?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I first came in, I walked in the door and there was one criminal intelligence analyst on the team, a counterterrorism analyst, and then we had a vacancy for, at the time it was a GIS analyst position. And so that's really the team that I walked into. There are sworn detectives within the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, which is where I'm based out of. And so we have the sworn detectives, and then we had these analyst positions. And when I walk in and start to learn my environment and learn, about some of the items that were being worked on, and learn what the expectations were, things like that, I started to really do some evaluation. I spent my first few months truly absorbing, evaluating, gathering feedback, gathering requirements, and really just trying to understand. The analyst that was there, when I first came in, and again, she's still with me now, I'm going to get a name drop with her, Bethany Tiernan. And man, she has truly helped me transition so nicely into this world, because I probably would have been very lost without her support. She's sat down, she's answered all of my questions over the last year. She's given me the historical perspective. She's told me the what, the why, the when, the who, and things like that. She presented me with her challenges, and we've just had some very raw and honest discussions about what going forward looks like. And so over the past year, I have ended up building out this team. One thing about working for the Amtrak Police Department is I've had a lot of leadership support, and that is sometimes, that's hard to come by, depending on the department, the situation, whatever the case is. Amtrak, it really has invested heavily in my unit, and it's been great, because I walked in the door, I was able to fill the vacancy. I converted the solo GIS analyst position to a lead data analyst for both our safety and security realms. I was able to bring on a principal data scientist for some pretty high-level complex projects that we work on. And I was able to hire 4 regionally embedded analysts, and they are embedded in 4 major cities throughout the nation. So I've got an analyst in Oakland, California, who supports our Western division. Got an analyst in Chicago who supports our Central division. Got an analyst in New York supporting our New York and New England divisions, and an analyst in Philadelphia supporting our entire Mid-Atlantic region. So that's everything from, the state of Pennsylvania all the way down to Florida. So the analysts in the field have pretty big AORs. And again, we do have 3 interns on the team: data science intern, counterterrorism intern, crime analyst intern, and actually just added a GIS intern. So we just added a 4th, actually. And so we're a pretty large, robust team. So I've been busy over the last year, Jason.
Well, I actually lost count. How many people is this?
I think we're upwards of like 13 now.
Wow.
By the time all was said and done. Because the big thing that I went in and said, listen, we are a nationwide department. We're in 46 states, which means we're dealing with 46 states of general statutes and laws that are just sometimes completely different and things like that. We need to covering the nation from headquarters in DC and being a good resource and support element to the field. This is not a sustainable model. And so this is what I'm saying. When I had leadership support and buy-in, I was able to do a 6-month review and presentation to our leadership. And I imagine my surprise and shock when they said, okay, we hear you, we're all in. And I'm like, what? This is great. And so the things that we've been able to accomplish over the last year has been astounding. We actually have a very interesting dynamic because not only do we work in the police department realm, but we also work very closely with our corporate security partners. So corporate security falls under the umbrella of the police department. And then we also work with our safety personnel. So we look at safety, corporate security, and police data under the umbrella of a corporation, and which means we get our hands on a lot of great information. My team does everything from your typical tactical, administrative, strategic analysis. Again, we do intelligence, national security items. We build dashboards. We do congressional reporting because we're a quasi-federal entity, if you will. So, we get inquiries from Congress, things like that, and we have to provide those statistics in those summaries, investigative research, case support, everything that you would experience in your local departments. We're doing the exact same things. We're doing networking with our local municipalities, trying to build those relationships so that as we go out and try to problem solve, we're looking at the entire picture and we have information flow. Putting out bulletin. One of my analysts just in Philadelphia just put out a bulletin today on some tagging that's going on our electrical poles, our catenary wires. The Northeast Corridor trains run off electrical wire. And I try to reserve your shock when I say that people try to steal copper wire. Yes. They try to steal copper wire. And so we put out bulletins to our partners, hey, be on the lookout for this and this type of information and things like that.
So what is Amtrak's police department's jurisdiction? How is that defined?
So, again, being a nationwide department, what happens is officers end up getting certified in the state in which they work. And so, it just depends on the laws of that state and what certifications they have to go through. But we tend to follow the rules of, again, those individual states and such. So what we'll have is officers, if they work in New York, they're certified in the state of New York, California, so on and so forth. So we have the same jurisdictional, boundaries like anyone would. We obviously along our property, so the stations that we patrol along the right of way of the tracks, our different facilities and things like that. It also depends on if we have MOUs in place with different, partners and such. And so, yeah, it's interesting seeing that dynamic in play because, it's so different all over the country.
You mentioned on the prep call, Amtrak as a resource for other analysts in police departments. Just when should an analyst from a local jurisdiction contact you all there at Amtrak?
Sure. Yeah, great question, Jason. So the one thing that I would definitely share is we sit on a gold mine of information, and we're happy to conduct research about anything that happens, on our system, in our facilities, whatever the case is. So give you kind of an example. We've been reached out to regarding missing persons, suspected trafficking victims, runaway juveniles, people like that. And people will check, they'll say, hey, we think that they frequent maybe your facilities and or they take Amtrak trains, whatever the case is. So we are able to pull in, people's manifests, look at their travel history, that type of information. We also are able to support items like looking at ridership. So one thing that we look at is, if there's going to be a major event, things like that, we're trying to understand maybe the impact of the volume. We will look at our bookings, our ridership. So are we seeing higher levels of ridership coming into these locations that we maybe wouldn't normally expect? So it kind of just gives us an idea, from an operational planning standpoint of what people's maybe travel patterns look like and or what the influx may look like. So as you can imagine, we look at a multitude of things, but again, we have a lot of the same resources that other law enforcement agencies do. So again, we definitely support investigative research and like that. But the big thing is, we definitely want to be an asset and a resource for those that maybe have individuals they're looking for and let us conduct those searches to see if there's anything from our system that we can provide.
So let's finish up with just maybe more of a general discussion on law enforcement and leadership. And I think you have an interesting perspective there as you've worked your way up to where you are now. I mean, what are some of the things maybe you would like to see law enforcement analysis do it to improve in the future in terms of leadership?
Oh, wow. So with that, Jason, I think we could go a couple different ways with that. As a leader, one thing that I really strive for is really seeking to understand the situation before making a judgment call or jumping to conclusions. And so, from a leadership perspective, it's critical, number one, to listen to your folks. Listen to what their concerns are, listen to what their interests are, listen to their interests in their own personal growth. I can't stress that enough that, investing in people's personal development and growth, how critical that is to recruitment and retention efforts. When I interview folks, I always ask about their future growth potential, what they're looking for there, what is a 5-year plan, that type of thing, because I want to know that I can support that vision. Can I help build you up to that, right? And so, that's one thing I would say is from a leadership perspective, invest in people, no matter what. Don't be afraid they're going to get so great that they're going to leave you, because the goal there is turn around and treat them so well that they don't want to go anywhere else, right?
Yeah. And I do think there's just limitation. You had mentioned there that you plateaued at the police department, right? There really wasn't anywhere else to go. And I almost don't see any significant development in terms of law enforcement analysis and leadership until the police departments have more civilians in executive roles. And there's more of a civilianization of the police department to where you get to the point where you just have people that have worked as civilian analysts, have worked their way up all the way to being on the chief's staff. Until that happens, you're going to have this point where people plateau, and then there's nowhere else to go but out if they want to improve.
I would agree with that assessment, Jason. The big thing for me was very difficult for me to make the decision, truthfully, to leave the department I had invested so much in. And here's the other reason why, is because, in Fayetteville, I did have a chief that invested in my personal development, and she, provided me, all kinds of professional development opportunities so that she could see me grow. The unfortunate side is I knew there were going to be budget limitations to additional elevation in my career there, and that's beyond any control that department would have had. However, I agree with what you're saying with that, because departments need that differing viewpoint. Departments tend to be very top heavy from a sworn element, but you don't always see the mix of civilians on that executive level. I think it would be a wonderful opportunity to diversify the perspective at the executive level if departments would embrace that. And you see it a little bit in the bigger department, obviously where there's a lot more money and such. But from a local government perspective, like a smaller scale department, you definitely run into those challenges. And so, you get somebody like me who says, okay, hey, I am worth my weight in gold, right? Word to the wise, know your worth. I'm worth my weight in gold, and I've got so much more in me that I want to do, and I want to grow, and I want to drive this profession forward as much as I can. What does that look like, right? And so then you have to make hard decisions.
Our last segment to the show is Words to the World, and this is where I give the guest the last word. Rachael, you can promote any idea that you wish. What are your words to the world?
So, Jason, my words to the world is something I learned a very long time ago. And really, it was the thing that's always stuck with me throughout my career and has done me very well is a long time ago that I needed to ensure that I was listening with the intent to understand rather than the intent to reply. And that has resonated with me and carried me very far in my career, because when people you're interacting with feel as though you are truly listening to them to understand what they're saying, what their problem is, what their interests are. Instead of listening with just the intent to get your next word in, you end up forming a better bond and relationship and rapport with individuals. So if I could give any word to the world outside is truly sit down and listen with that intent to understand, even if the viewpoint is different from yours. You'll be amazed at what you learn.
Very good. Well, I leave every guest with you've given me just enough to talk bad about you later. But I do appreciate you being on the show, Rachael. Thank you so much, and you be safe.
Thank you, Jason. I appreciate it.